Okay, so today we're going to be talking about police operations. Within that, we're going to be focusing a lot on different measurements of policing styles, patrol styles, and police efficiency. So, to start, police use a top-down approach. Unfortunately, the top-down approach to policing typically leads in overlapping responsibilities and efficiencies, and it also limits discretion, which is not great. Police are also criticized for not meeting social needs and inadequately addressing things like cyberbullying, and as a result, activism from vigilante groups tends to start. But police do what they can, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. They are our defense against crime. So we're going to look at efficiency. So efficiency is measured by response times and arrest rates. The idea is that how quickly a response is made and how many arrests happen are indicative of efficiency, but this is wrong, and we'll talk about why. So just to quickly address the first one, response times, the reason that this can be inaccurate, is because response times can be influenced by other variables, right? You're not getting the clear picture, so they are negatively influenced by the longer it takes for citizens to call them. Within these calls, there are two different management strategies called demand and differential responses. Essentially, what this is saying is that calls will be treated differently based on the department, and that can have an impact on how quickly police respond. In Calgary, also, we recently had a centralization of all EMS, and due to that kind of constipation in the system, again, responses were impacted. So it's not an accurate measure. Arrest rates. This is how essentially measuring crime strictly based off of arrests. This is not an ideal measure, and the reason for that is because crimes are often unreported, and arrests that happen don't always lead to prosecution. And then naturally that person can be out on the street, and so it's not necessarily another measure of efficiency that we'd like to look at. Additionally, some officers are kind of more strict and some are less strict. Clearance rates are another method. It's not great, but the idea essentially is that we look at how many cases police have solved in relation to how many arrests are made and crimes that take place. You're kind of taking in everything. From this, charges aren't always made in court, but police do what they can. It's essentially taking the case to its logical end based on the evidence, and this is good, but it's not great. Two ways that are better are to identify the number of arrests that follow through to prosecution and evaluating fear reduction by an officer. These are two ways that we can really manage effectiveness and efficiency, right? The police role. What do police do? The police role generally is defined by specific rights, responsibilities, and expectations associated with police positions. They're complex, and the reason for that is because of us, the public. We expect a lot from police officers. We kind of expect them to be this crime fighter who is more about enforcement and cracking down on crime, but we also expect them to be social agents where they're more community-oriented. And this has a lot of conflicting nature to it. And we'll see here in this expansion of policing styles by Muir and Wilson that there's an idea of these different branches of police characterization that kind of overlook this idea of this conflicting role, right? So to get into this, we'll start with Muir's classification. Muir's idea was to establish whether a police officer had passion or perspective, with different officers landing on different sides of the spectrum. So passion is essentially a police's willingness to use force when necessary to control the situation, and perspective is the ability to empathize with suffering and to be ethical and moral. So we have different styles of policing. We have professionals, which use both passion and perspective. They use force when necessary, and they empathize with others' suffering. We have enforcers who are lax on perspective, but they're very passionate. So you usually see them being over-aggressive. Reciprocators lack passion. They have difficulty kind of enforcing arrests and using authority. And this is usually due to having too much perspective and too much empathy. And avoiders, which are kind of not using either. They're not really empathetic, and they don't really realize when they should use force. Wilson's classifications. Wilson identified 4 different types, kind of a more effective typology, and we use Wilson's more today than we do in Weir's. So he identified a social agent, which are these policemen that think of themselves as social workers with a responsibility to maintain and evaluate the mental health and well-being of individuals in the public, while also having police-based authority. Where instead of being a bystander, they'll directly intervene to solve problems, right? We have the watchman, which emphasizes public order while being fairly tolerant of private matters and conflict. So the goal of the job is to restore peace and order before an interaction took place, but at the same time, due to this watchman's status, they'll kind of stand by and only intervene exactly when necessary. The law enforcer classification, they enforce all laws, including minor offenses. They'll pretty much intervene in literally any violation of the law. It's raw legal positivism, as we say. What is right is lawful, and if you break that, you're breaking the law, no matter what. Yeah, their discretion is minimal. They don't like to really consider, based on different classifications, what they will and won't go after. It's mostly just about, are you breaking the law or not, right? The crime fighter. These people are soldiers. They're full of ego. They think of themselves as the people that hold society together, and if not, it'll fall apart. They're the ones keeping chaos at bay, and they're the soldiers, right? So we have these different classifications here from 2 different perspectives. Police patrol. Patrolling is seen as the backbone of policing, and it was introduced by Robert Peel in 1829. Police patrol in order to deter crime, maintain public order, and provide 24-hour community services. It's important, just before we move on, to realize that a lot of police work involves activities unrelated to crime, even within patrols. So, for example, again, you see 80% of police activity relates to non-criminal issues, right? Neighborhood disputes, noise complaints, non-criminal things, and this is all due to patrolling. So we have different types of patrols here. We have incident-driven or reactive policing, which is where police react to citizens' calls for help, right? It's directly responding to them calling. Proactive policing, which is where you're kind of already on the street, you're looking out for crime. You're cracking down on drugs, prostitution, etc., etc. You're interacting with these criminals before crimes occur. Yeah. Now, it's important to realize it's not really 100% clear if patrol officer arrests actually deter crime, but patrolling can be directed in several ways. So, directed patrol, here we're looking at so it's not literally directed, as in like we're kind of assigning it to a role. Directed patrolling in the ways that police can be directed. And patrolling is simply directing them to different areas of a city, right? Directed patrols occur when a police officer's time is spent in certain locations. This is helpful for reducing car theft and stuff. It's unclear whether it really stops crime or just displaces it to other areas. Hotspots have been studied, where hotspots are increases in certain locations, and studies on them show a slight decrease of criminal activity, but it's kind of iffy. And then we have foot patrols. Foot patrols existed before we had cars, widespread cars. These were dominant in the 30s, resurged in the 70s. And we really saw this in the Flint neighborhood foot patrol program, where you essentially had all of these cops on foot patrolling. It reduced crime slightly, but most importantly, it generated more confidence in the police and reduced the fear of crime. We saw this in Newark, Toronto, and Edmonton as well. We're going to look at a little experiment here. The Kansas City Prevention Patrol experiment. So the idea behind this was to see if citizens would notice an increase in police presence, and if actively being on the street searching for crime would have an effect on crime rates. To do this, crime was split into 3 different areas. There was reactive patrolling, or as we saw here, incident-driven patrolling, where patrols would be responding to calls. There was nothing proactive about it. We had proactive controlling, which is where officers would only be on the street looking for crime and not respond to calls at all. And then we had control. So like typical patrolling, sometimes they would be responding to calls, sometimes they would be patrolling. Unfortunately, the findings were kind of inconclusive. Actually, they weren't inconclusive at all. We saw no significant difference in crime or anything around crime. And we looked at a bunch of different methods to determine that. And yeah, nothing was conclusive. We do have studies that show that increasing police coverage in neighborhoods does deter crime. But the goal of the study wasn't to test that. It was to test if the budget could be concentrated differently and included an adjusted approach to patrolling, right? So again, might have been ineffective because police coverage was spread too thin, where crime would take place between patrols, the inability to prevent certain types of crimes because many crimes are concealed, and the displacement effect, where patrols push crimes into less monitored areas. Criminal investigation, let's look at this for a sec. When you're investigating crime, the goal is to reconstruct crime events through informational gathering. It usually includes a preliminary investigation, follow-up investigation. And 8 out of 10 arrests are due to an initial response rather than actual detective work in criminal investigation. Let's look at different policing models and approaches here. So how this is going to work, we have a general breakdown here, and then we look a little bit lower, and we look a little bit lower, and we have an expansion of that, right? So the issues with traditional policing is, police patrols don't really do much to reduce crime. Detectives don't really do much. Private security forces are kind of fucking the system, etc., etc. So there are a bunch of different models, and the first two are kind of linked. This is the broken windows model, and below that, the zero tolerance policing model, right? The broken window model, made by Kelling and Wilson in 1982, we'll talk about Wilson in a different chapter on his study about race and their response to police. The idea in the broken window model is that the police need the community to fight crime. Neighborhood disorder creates fear, and disorder through fear sends out crime-promoting signals, so the police should get involved at the first signs of deterioration in order to kind of boost up the community. This is directly tied to, again, the zero-tolerance policing approach, where focuses on order maintenance and embracing the crime attack model / suppression, where you're more tough on crime. Through this, we're looking at the fact that communities might not be able to police themselves. We're concentrating on specific types of crime, more violent crime mostly. But also, we're looking at the weaker kind of crime, right? The idea is that if you go after the lower level offender, it prevents more serious crime, right? Because if that person got away, they'll gravitate to something more serious. Yeah, it's kind of centralized to certain areas, and it favors the current command structure that we currently function with. We're going to recap all of these later. Problem-oriented policing is taking a direct look at the cause of crime and directing resources to that. You're tackling underlying causes of crime, not just the symptoms. Instead of directly attacking criminals, we try to solve the underlying problems, and we try to collaborate with the community, like we saw with the Kansas City Gun Project. And finally, community policing. This is strengthening community capacity to self-police. Police will sometimes not be there, but the citizens always are, so it's important that they can police. This established mini stations and community police partnership focusing on disorder decay and fear reduction. This is essentially closer to what we have today. Or what we are pushing for today, right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Just specifying here, the broken window model need the police. The police need the community to work with them to fight crime, but differently than the community model. Okay. Just to recap this, we have this table here. So we have a focus, culture, organization and command, and measurement of success model for each of these. So with traditional policing, again, the focus was enforcement. The culture was inward, and you're kind of rejecting community involvement. The organization of command is centralized, and the measurement of success with traditional policing is in the amount of arrests made and the crime rates. In community police, the policing focus is community building. Police culture is outward, and it's about building partnerships with the community. Yeah. Organization and command is decentralized, where we have more stations with fewer people spread out, and its measurement is varied. We kind of measure it through crime calls, fear reduction, community linkages, etc. Problem-oriented policing. With this, I wonder if I might have taken some of these notes down just a little bit funny. Because you'd think here, just kind of talking to myself, that the broken window model would be the traditional model here. And I think it just might be. Anywho, let's get into it. Yeah, problem-oriented policing, the focus is law and order, fear problems, etc., etc., and kind of helping with that, mostly what the community needs. The culture is mixed, but it's kind of like analysis focused on evidence. The organization and command of it is decentralized with a local command, and its measurement of success is varied, but mostly on a problem solved, crime displaced, and minimized effect. And finally, zero tolerance policing. It's focused on problems that disrupt order, focusing on them in order to maintain said order. Its culture is inward, focusing on attacking the crime problem. Its organization and command is centralized or decentralized with internal focus, largely about maintaining traditional police hierarchies. And its measurement of success are like arrests, field stops, activity, location-specific crime reductions. Now again, just to answer my own question from earlier, zero tolerance policing is very similar to traditional policing, but it's very, very aggressive. Yeah. Yeah. Very nice. Right? Yeah. And finally, we have intelligence-led policing. This is new. This is more crime-based. Police kind of globally, through multi-agency partnerships, assess risk in society, and they use computer-assisted programs for identifying high-crime places and such. Yeah, it's gonna be it for police operations. Not too shabby.